I've been a little bit MIA for a couple days, due to having 5 midterms in 6 days. We're not going to talk about that. Let's instead talk about an interesting phenomenon that happens in genetic diseases called anticipation or slippage. This happens in a couple different genetically passed down diseases such as Huntington's disease and myotonic dystrophy. If you don't know what those are, they're 2 distinct diseases that have very similar symptoms but different causes, but they are biochemically pretty similar in what they do. They're involved in muscles and your neurological functions. So a slightly quick overview of the diseases. Huntington's disease is involved with your muscles and nerves, and it involves kind of uncontrolled muscle actions like twitches and just you can't really control your muscles. It involves decreased motor functions, loss of fine motor skills, as well as degradation in cognitive abilities and mental function. There's quite a bit of involuntary movement, especially in the limbs and other extremities and the facial muscles, which causes kind of uncontrolled movement that you can't really do anything about. In myotonic dystrophy, it's vaguely similar. It's a lack of muscle control and nerve control, but instead of resulting in jerky, uncontrolled movements, it kind of results in an inability to relax your muscles. That's what myotonia is. It just makes you, for example, if you clench your fist, you are unable to unclench it for a lot longer than people without the myotonic dystrophy. So I can clench my fist and then just go like that. People with myotonic dystrophy can clench their fist, but they can't really release it until, like, your muscles decide you can. Both of these diseases also have neurological components with reduced attention span, reduced cognitive abilities, and a bunch of other things, but both of them also have a very interesting thing where the symptoms and the onset get amplified over generation. Now, both of these conditions arise from abnormally long repeats of a single gene in your genetic code. There's difference between the different diseases, but they both come from the same cause when your gene is repeated way more often than it should be. Now, if you have a normal number of the repeats of your gene, you'll be fine. There's no risk. You won't have the disease. Then you can have slightly longer than normal repeats, which is usually asymptomatic, where you don't really express any of the symptoms, but it's more likely that you will pass it on to your kids. Now, with a very long string of repeats, then you will start to get the symptoms, you'll have, like, expression of the disease, and that's usually not a good time. And then with really, really long ones, it's usually congenital, which means it's present from birth instead of being expressed later in your life like many of these diseases are. Now, where the anticipation or the slippage comes into play, these extended gene repeats are often very, very unstable. So, and this only happens in women, which is interesting. In women, sometimes the gene repeats can amplify to, like, crazy lengths, and that means while the mother doesn't really express these genes, they may amplify a ton in the next generation. So even if she doesn't have any symptoms, her kids will have way more repeats than she does, and they will have symptoms that are much more severe and much earlier onset than the mother would. Now, it does very, very rarely happen in males where the slippage is, but almost always it's passed down from the mother. Now, this is interesting because, say we have the first generation. She has slightly more than the normal number of repeats of this gene, and she doesn't even know she has the disease. She has no symptoms, there's nothing to indicate that she has anything wrong with this specific gene. Then she goes on to have a kid. That kid has more repeats than the mother had due to the amplification of the genes, but again, maybe she has some mild symptoms that appear later on in life. Now, depending on the age that these symptoms appear at, they could be confused with a bunch of other things such as Parkinson's or just regular symptoms of aging, such as like memory loss, loss of motor functions, all that. But before those symptoms appeared in the daughter, that daughter then has kids, the grandkids of the original patient. Now, due to the slippage, these symptoms are even more prevalent and come at an even earlier age, perhaps in their 20s or 30s instead of later on in their 60s or 70s or even 80s. Then perhaps the granddaughter notices something's up because her symptoms were more severe and earlier onset, so she goes to the doctor and like, hey, I've been noticing some things recently, what's up with that? And maybe she gets diagnosed with something. There are other complications that can arise from these disorders, such as diabetes or hypothyroidism, which may not be correlated to either Huntington's or the myotonic dystrophy. So perhaps she gets some of her symptoms treated. Again, they don't quite know what it is yet. She goes on to have a kid, and that kid has congenital issues, one of the two, or maybe perhaps a third, since the slippage has amplified so much that this kid now is congenital with the disease and has very severe symptoms from a very, very young age. This is due to the amplification. Again, now the great-grandmother, nothing, no symptoms, completely fine. Her daughter, some mild symptoms, maybe think it's just due to aging. The granddaughter has some pretty severe symptoms, but again, don't entirely know what it is because the symptoms can get confused with a lot of other things. But then, the baby, the great-granddaughter, it's got a bunch of birth issues due to the congenital diagnosis. And by this point, the daughter and the granddaughter have started expressing the later onset symptoms, so now you can get a kind of definitive diagnosis of one of these two diseases. Because it is rather hard to diagnose things because the symptoms are very non-specific. They vary between tissue types and between individuals, so it's very hard to diagnose what either of these diseases. But I just think that this is very interesting because there aren't that many diseases that you get genetically that are amplified between generations. So this is very interesting, just kind of how it works, because these gene segments that are abnormally large are very, very unstable. So as the cells divide during DNA replication, instead of making the same normal amount, they make way more than they need to. It's a little bit excessive. But yeah, that's just a very interesting disease that I'm learning about in the class that I'm supposed to be studying for right now.